The morning mist clung to the Tennessee valleys like a shroud of war, but nothing could have prepared the Union soldiers for the hellish symphony that would soon erupt from the woods of Chickamauga on September 18, 1863. The air itself seemed to hold its breath as two massive armies converged on a collision course that would determine the fate of the South. Major General William Stark Rosecrans had been feeling confident about his Army of the Cumberland's advance into Georgia. His forces had successfully maneuvered Confederate General Braxton Bragg's Army of Tennessee out of Middle Tennessee and were now pursuing them deeper into Confederate territory. The Union commander believed he had Bragg on the run, retreating toward Atlanta. What Rosecrans didn't know was that he was walking his 60,000 men straight into a carefully laid trap. General Bragg had been reinforced by Lieutenant General James Longstreet's corps from Virginia, bringing his total strength to nearly 65,000 men. The Confederate commander had chosen his ground well. The dense forests and creek beds around Chickamauga Creek would favor his defensive strategy, while neutralizing the Union's numerical advantages in artillery and cavalry. As dawn broke on that fateful September morning, Union cavalry under Colonel Robert Mitty encountered Confederate infantry crossing Chickamauga Creek near Reed's Bridge. The sharp crack of carbines echoed through the morning air as the two forces clashed in what would be the opening notes of a bloody D-Day symphony. The sound carried across the countryside, alerting both armies that the dance of death was about to begin. According to historical accounts documented in the Civil War, a narrative by Shelby Foote, the terrain itself would become a character in this unfolding drama. The thick woods of northwestern Georgia created a nightmare landscape where regiments could become lost within yards of each other, where the smoke of battle would hang like fog between the trees, and where the cries of wounded men would be muffled by the dense canopy above. General Thomas Wood's division was among the first Union forces to respond to the cavalry skirmish. As his men formed battle lines in the early morning light, they could hear the distant rumble of artillery being wheeled into position and the shouted commands of officers preparing their regiments for combat. The soldiers knew they were about to enter something far larger than a simple skirmish. The very air seemed charged with the electricity of impending battle. Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest's cavalry had been screening Bragg's movements for days, and now his horsemen were falling back through the woods, drawing the Union forces deeper into the Confederate web. Every step the Federal troops took brought them closer to a confrontation that would test not just their military prowess, but their very souls. The stage was set for what would become the largest battle ever fought in Georgia. A clash that would see brother fighting brother in the shadows of ancient trees, where the creek waters would run red with the blood of America's sons, and where the outcome would determine whether the Confederacy could reclaim the initiative in the Western theater of the war. As the sun climbed higher in the September sky, both armies continued their deadly convergence, unaware that they were about to participate in one of the most savage battles of the entire Civil War. The morning of September 19, 1863, erupted in violence as General George Thomas's 14th Corps collided with Confederate forces in the tangled wilderness near Chickamauga Creek. The battle had begun in earnest, and the forest itself seemed to scream as thousands of men threw themselves into combat among the towering pines and thick underbrush. General John Bell Hood's Confederate division struck like a thunderbolt against the Union left flank. His Texans and Arkansans, veterans of countless battles, advanced through the woods with their distinctive rebel yell piercing the morning air. The sound was both terrifying and inspiring, a primal cry that had become the soundtrack of Confederate charges across dozens of battlefields. Union Colonel John Wilder's mounted infantry, armed with Spencer repeating rifles, had positioned themselves along the Lafayette Road. As Hood's men emerged from the tree line, Wilder's troops unleashed a devastating wall of rapid fire. The new Spencer rifles could fire 7 rounds without reloading, and the Confederate advance staggered under the unprecedented volume of fire. Bodies fell like autumn leaves as the gray-clad soldiers pressed forward through the deadly hail of bullets. The fighting was unlike anything either army had experienced. In the dense woods, regimental formations dissolved into confused masses of men fighting hand-to-hand with bayonets. Rifle butts, and even fists, officers lost contact with. Their commands as units became separated in the maze of trees and smoke. The traditional tactics of Civil War warfare became meaningless in this green hell, where visibility rarely extended beyond 50 yards. General Bragg had positioned his army in a rough semicircle, hoping to envelop the Union forces and crush them. Against Chickamauga Creek, throughout the morning, Confederate attacks rolled forward like waves against a rocky shore. General Patrick Coburn's division, known as the Stonewall of the West, hammered against Thomas's corps with relentless fury. The Irishman's men were some of the finest fighters in the Confederate Army, and they pressed their assault with characteristic determination. The sound of battle was deafening. The crash of musketry, the boom of artillery, and the screams of wounded men created a cacophony that could be heard for miles. Thick smoke from thousands of rifle discharges hung in the still air beneath the forest canopy, creating an eerie twilight even at midday. Men fired at muzzle flashes in the gloom, often unable to see their targets clearly. General Rosecrans rode frantically between his corps' commanders, trying to coordinate a defense against the Confederate onslaught. His army was stretched thin, along a front of nearly 6 miles, and gaps kept appearing in his lines as units were shifted to meet each new Confederate thrust. The Union commander was beginning to realize that he had walked into a trap, but there was no choice now but to fight his way out. By afternoon, the battle had become a series of desperate local engagements. Regiments would charge forward, clash briefly in brutal combat, then fall back to regroup before charging again. The casualty lists grew longer with each passing hour. Companies that had started the day with 80 men found themselves reduced to 20 or 30 by evening. As darkness finally brought an end to the first day's carnage, both armies held roughly the same positions they had occupied at dawn. The cost had been terrible, nearly 16,000 casualties in a single day of fighting. The wounded lay scattered throughout the woods, their cries for water and medical attention echoing through the night. Both commanders knew that tomorrow would bring even worse slaughter. As they prepared to resume their deadly dance, the pre-dawn hours of September 20th, 1863, brought an ominous quiet to the blood-soaked battlefields around Chickamauga Creek. In the Confederate camps, Lieutenant General James Longstreet was finalizing plans for what he hoped would be the decisive blow against Rosecrans's battered Army of the Cumberland. The Georgian had arrived just days earlier with 2 divisions from the Army of Northern Virginia, and his fresh troops represented Bragg's best hope for complete victory. General Bragg's strategy for the second day was elegantly simple. General Leonidas Polk would attack the Union right flank at dawn, rolling up Thomas's corps from north to south. Once Polk had engaged the enemy and drawn their reserves northward, Longstreet would launch his assault against what Bragg hoped would be a weakened Union left and center. The plan required precise timing and coordination, to qualities that had often been lacking in Confederate operations. As the first gray light of dawn filtered through the smoke-stained trees, Polk's artillery opened fire. The thunderous cannonade shattered the morning stillness and signaled the beginning of what would become one of the most devastating days in American military history. General Daniel Harvey Hill's corps led the assault, his North Carolinians and Tennesseans advancing through the same deadly woods that had claimed so many lives the previous day. Thomas's men, now holding what would become known as the Union left, had spent the night constructing crude breastworks from fallen logs and rocks. These hasty fortifications would prove invaluable as wave after wave of Confederate infantry crashed against their positions. The Federal troops, many of them veterans of Stone's River and other Western battles, fought with desperate courage as they realized their army's survival hung in the balance. General Patrick Coburn's division struck Thomas's line with particular ferocity. The Irish-born general had earned a reputation as one of the finest division commanders in either army, and his men reflected their leader's aggressive spirit. Arkansas and Texas regiments charged repeatedly against the Union breastworks, leaving hundreds of casualties scattered across the forest floor. With each assault, historical records from the official records of the War of the Rebellion document the incredible intensity of the fighting along Thomas's front. where some regiments sustained casualty rates exceeding 60% during the morning's combat. Meanwhile, General Rosecrans was growing increasingly anxious about gaps in his battle line. Reports from his corps' commanders painted a confusing picture of units out of position, communications severed, and Confederate forces appearing at unexpected locations. The Union commander's staff worked frantically to maintain contact with scattered divisions while trying to coordinate an effective defense. The crucial moment came around 11 o'clock in the morning. Rosecrans received a message indicating that General Thomas John Wood's division had a gap to its right. Without personally reconnoitering the situation, Rosecrans immediately ordered Wood to close up and support Reynolds, referring to General Joseph Reynolds's division. The order seemed clear enough, but it would prove to be one of the most catastrophic commands issued during the entire Civil War. Wood, a professional soldier who followed orders to the letter, began moving his division northward to support Reynolds. In doing so, he created exactly what Longstreet had been waiting for: a massive gap in the Union center. The irony was devastating. In trying to close a gap that didn't exist, Rosecrans had created a real one that would destroy his army. Longstreet, observing from his position opposite the Union center, could hardly believe his good fortune. The gap in the Federal line was nearly a quarter-mile wide, and it lay directly in front of his corps. Without hesitation, the veteran general ordered his divisions forward in a concentrated assault that would split the Union army in half and send Rosecrans fleeing from the battlefield in panic. At precisely 11:15 on the morning of September 20th, 1863, Lieutenant General James Longstreet unleashed 8 Confederate brigades in a massive assault against the gaping hole in the Union center. What followed was one of the most complete tactical victories achieved by either side during the entire Civil War, a demonstration of how quickly fortune could shift on Civil War battlefields. When commanders made critical errors under pressure, General Jerome Robertson's Texas Brigade led the Confederate charge, their battle flags streaming in the smoky air as they poured through the gap left by Wood's withdrawal. Behind them came General Evander Law's Alabamians, General Joseph Kershaw's South Carolinians, and General William Wofford's Georgians. The sight of this gray tide flowing through the breach struck terror into the hearts of Union soldiers on either flank, who suddenly found Confederate forces appearing in their rear. The collapse was immediate and catastrophic. General Philip Sheridan's division, which had been positioned to Wood's left, found itself attacked from 3 directions simultaneously. Sheridan, who would later become one of the Union's most celebrated cavalry commanders, fought desperately to maintain his position, but his men were overwhelmed by the sheer weight of Longstreet's assault. Within minutes, entire Union regiments were fleeing toward Chattanooga in complete disorder. General Jefferson Davis's division suffered an even worse fate. As Longstreet's men swept around their right flank, Davis's brigades simply disintegrated. Under the combined shock of frontal and flanking attacks, men threw down their weapons and ran for their lives as Confederate cavalry, led by General Nathan Bedford Forrest, pursued the fleeing Federals with sabers and pistols. The chase extended for miles along the roads leading back to Tennessee. The psychological impact on the Union Army was devastating. General Rosecrans himself, caught in the tide of retreating soldiers, became convinced that his entire army was destroyed. The Union commander, his staff, and several corps commanders were swept along with the retreating mob, abandoning the battlefield and racing toward Chattanooga. For several crucial hours, the Army of the Cumberland was effectively leaderless as its senior commanders fled in panic. But while the Union right and center collapsed in complete disorder, General George Thomas's 14th Corps maintained its position on the left flank like a rocket. A hurricane, the Virginian, who had remained loyal to the Union despite his Southern birth, recognized immediately that he was now the only thing standing between Longstreet's victorious Confederates and the complete destruction of Rosecrans's army. Thomas quickly began pulling back his scattered units to a defensive position on Snodgrass Hill, a rocky elevation that offered some natural advantages. Throughout the afternoon, as Longstreet's jubilant Confederates pressed their attack, Thomas's men fought with desperate courage to buy time for the rest of the army to escape. Regiment after regiment was fed into the defense of the hill, and each one was ground down by the relentless Confederate assault. The fighting on Snodgrass Hill was among the most intense of the entire battle. Confederate brigades charged up the slope repeatedly, only to be thrown back by devastating volleys from Thomas's infantry. The hillside became carpeted with casualties. As both sides poured men into the struggle, Union artillery, positioned on the crest of the hill, fired canister rounds point blank into the advancing Confederate ranks, creating scenes of incredible carnage. As documented in Bruce Catton's The Civil War, Thomas's stand on Snodgrass Hill would earn him the nickname the Rock of Chickamauga, and would be remembered as one of the finest defensive actions by any Civil War general. General Gordon Granger's reserve corps, which had been positioned several miles north of the main battle, began marching toward the sound of the guns on his own initiative. Granger's timely arrival with fresh troops provided Thomas with just enough reinforcement to maintain his position until nightfall. The two generals coordinated a fighting withdrawal that saved what remained of the Army of the Cumberland from complete destruction. As darkness fell on September 20th, the Confederate Army held the field, but their victory was incomplete. Thomas's heroic stand had prevented the total annihilation of the Union force, allowing tens of thousands of Federal soldiers to escape toward Chattanooga. The stage was now set for the final act of this bloody drama. As the September sun began its descent toward the western horizon, on the 20th day of 1863, General George Henry Thomas found himself commanding what remained of the Army of the Cumberland's fighting spirit, while Rosecrans and his staff fled toward Chattanooga in panic, believing their army destroyed. Thomas coolly assessed the desperate situation and prepared to make one of the most heroic stands in American military history. The position Thomas had chosen on Snodgrass Hill was naturally strong but far from impregnable. The rocky slopes provided some cover for his men, but the hill could be approached from multiple directions, and Thomas's force was badly outnumbered by Longstreet's victorious Confederates. The Virginian-born general knew that his primary mission was no longer to win the battle. That was impossible, but to delay the Confederate pursuit long enough for the shattered remnants of the Union Army to reach safety. General James Longstreet, flush with his morning victory, was determined to complete the destruction of the Federal forces. He could see that Thomas's corps represented the last organized resistance on the battlefield, and he ordered his division commanders to press their attacks with renewed vigor. The Confederate general knew that if he could crush Thomas's position before dark, he might be able to pursue and destroy Rosecrans's entire army before it could reach the safety of Chattanooga's fortifications. The first Confederate assault on Snodgrass Hill came from General Joseph Kershaw's South Carolina Brigade. These veterans had helped spearhead Longstreet's breakthrough earlier in the day, and they advanced up the rocky slopes with confidence. But Thomas's men, fighting now with the desperation of cornered animals, met them with a withering fire that stopped the attack cold. Bodies in gray uniforms dotted the hillside as the Carolinians fell back to regroup. General Evander Law's Alabama Brigade tried next, approaching the hill from a different angle. Law's men were among the finest troops in Lee's army, veterans of Gettysburg and numerous other battles, but the terrain worked against them, forcing them to attack uphill against well-positioned defenders. Thomas's artillery, commanded by Captain Lyman Bridges, raked the advancing Confederates with canister shot, turning the slope into a killing field. Throughout the afternoon, wave after wave of Confederate infantry crashed against Thomas's position. General William Wofford's Georgians, General Jerome Robertson's Texans, and elements of General John Bell Hood's division all participated in the desperate assault. Each attack was beaten back with heavy casualties, but Thomas's force was also being steadily worn down. Ammunition was running low, casualties were mounting, and gaps were appearing in the Union line. The situation became critical around 4 o'clock when General Bushrod Johnson's Confederate division threatened to outflank Thomas's left. Just as it appeared that the Union position might finally collapse, salvation appeared in the form of General Gordon Granger's reserve corps. Granger, an aggressive Union general, had been positioned north of the main battle with orders to guard the Army's supply lines, But when he heard the sound of heavy fighting to the south, he made the crucial decision to march toward the guns without orders. Granger's arrival with 2 fresh brigades provided Thomas with just enough strength to maintain his position. The Reserve Corps' troops, led by General James Steedman, counterattacked against Johnson's Confederates and restored the Union left flank for the next several hours. The combined force held Snodgrass Hill against increasingly desperate Confederate assaults. The fighting was incredibly intense. Men loaded and fired as fast as they could work their weapons, creating a continuous roar of musketry that echoed across the battlefield. The smoke was so thick that soldiers could barely see their targets, and many firefights took place at ranges of less than 50 yards. Officers on both sides fell in alarming numbers as they exposed themselves to rally their men. As the sun began to set, Thomas recognized that his mission was accomplished. The surviving elements of Rosecrans's army had gained enough time to reach relative safety, and continuing to hold Snodgrass Hill after dark would serve no useful purpose. The general began organizing a fighting withdrawal, pulling his men back by regiments while maintaining enough fire to discourage Confederate pursuit. The evacuation of Snodgrass Hill was conducted with the same professional skill that had characterized Thomas's entire defense. Units withdrew in rotation, with each regiment covering the retreat of the next. By 9 o'clock that evening, the last Union soldiers had disappeared into the darkness, leaving the Confederates in possession of a field littered with the debris of battle but denied the complete victory they had sought. As the first light of September 21, 1863, crept across the corpse-strewn battlefields of Chickamauga, both armies began the grim task of counting their losses and assessing the strategic implications of one of the bloodiest encounters of the American Civil War. The Confederate Army of Tennessee held the field, but the cost of their victory would prove to be almost as devastating as defeat. General Braxton Bragg rode across the battlefield in the early morning hours, surveying the carnage that his army had both inflicted and endured. The sight was overwhelming even for a veteran of numerous battles. Bodies lay scattered throughout the woods, in horrifying profusion, many so mangled by artillery fire that identification was impossible. The wounded, both Union and Confederate, cried out for water and medical attention from their positions among the fallen leaves and broken trees. The casualty figures, when finally tallied, told the story of the battle's savage intensity. The Confederate Army of Tennessee had suffered over 18,000 casualties, nearly 30% of Bragg's total force. Among the dead were some of the South's finest regimental and brigade commanders, men whose experience and leadership could never be adequately replaced. The Army of the Cumberland had lost approximately 16,000 men, but unlike their Confederate opponents, the Union could more easily absorb such losses due to their superior numbers and resources. General James Longstreet, despite his tactical triumph on September 20th, was frustrated by the incomplete nature of the Confederate victory. He had argued strongly for an immediate pursuit of the retreating Union forces, believing that Rosecrans's demoralized army could be completely destroyed if pressed aggressively. But Bragg, cautious by nature and shaken by his army's heavy losses, had hesitated to order a pursuit that might result in even greater casualties. The strategic situation was complex and would have far-reaching consequences for both the Confederacy and the Union cause. Rosecrans's Army of the Cumberland had retreated to Chattanooga, where they were now effectively under siege. The vital rail junction that connected the eastern and western theaters of the war was in Confederate hands, at least temporarily. But the cost of achieving this advantage had been enormous, and many Confederate officers questioned whether their army could sustain such Pyrrhic victories. Among the Union casualties was Colonel Hans Christian Haig, the Norwegian-born commander of the 15th Wisconsin Infantry. Haig had been mortally wounded while leading his Scandinavian immigrants in a desperate charge against overwhelming Confederate forces. His death symbolized the terrible price that America's immigrant communities were paying in the struggle to preserve the Union. Similar stories of sacrifice could be found throughout both armies. As communities across North and South mourned their fallen sons, the medical situation in both armies was appalling. Field hospitals, hastily established in barns, churches, and private homes, were overwhelmed by the sheer number of wounded men requiring attention. Surgeons worked for days without rest, performing amputations and other procedures under primitive conditions. The fortunate wounded were eventually transported to better facilities in Atlanta or Chattanooga, but many died of infection, blood loss, or shock before they could receive proper medical care. General Nathan Bedford Forrest's Confederate cavalry had captured hundreds of Union stragglers during the retreat to Chattanooga, but the Southern horsemen had also suffered significant losses during 2 days of almost continuous combat. Forrest himself had been engaged in hand-to-hand fighting on multiple occasions, at one point killing a Union soldier with his saber after his horse was shot from under him. The legendary cavalry commander emerged from Chickamauga with an enhanced reputation, but his force would require weeks to recover and refit. The psychological impact of the battle was perhaps as significant as the physical casualties. For the Confederacy, Chickamauga represented proof that they could still win major victories against superior numbers. When properly led and positioned, the success renewed hope throughout the South that the war might yet be won through superior fighting spirit and tactical skill. But perceptive Confederate leaders recognized that they could not afford many more such victories. For the Union, the defeat at Chickamauga was a sobering reminder that the war was far from over despite recent successes at Gettysburg and Vicksburg. The loss of Chattanooga threatened to undo much of the strategic progress that had been made in the Western theater. More importantly, the battle demonstrated that Confederate armies remained dangerous opponents, capable of inflicting devastating defeats on overconfident Union commanders. As both armies tended their wounded and buried their dead, the stage was being set for the next phase of the campaign. The siege of Chattanooga would test the resolve of both sides and ultimately determine whether the Confederate victory at Chickamauga would prove strategically meaningful or merely a costly delay in the Union's eventual triumph. In the weeks following the Battle of Chickamauga, the full magnitude of what had transpired in the Tennessee wilderness became clear to both the Confederate and Union leadership. What had begun as General Rosecrans's confident pursuit of a retreating enemy had evolved into one of the most decisive Confederate victories of the war, yet also one that would ultimately contribute to the South's eventual downfall. General Bragg's decision not to pursue the retreating Army of the Cumberland immediately after the battle would be debated by military historians for generations. Lieutenant General James Longstreet and many other Confederate officers believed that September 21st offered a golden opportunity to complete the destruction of Rosecrans's demoralized forces. Instead, Bragg allowed the Union Army to entrench around Chattanooga, where they could be supplied by a circuitous mountain route and reinforced from other theaters. The Confederate commander's caution was not entirely without merit. His army had suffered devastating casualties, with some regiments reduced to less than half their original strength. The Army of Tennessee's command structure had been shattered, with numerous generals and colonels among the dead and wounded. General John Bell Hood had been severely wounded and would never again command with the same effectiveness. The loss of experienced officers at all levels would plague the Confederate Army for the remainder of the war. President Abraham Lincoln's response to the disaster at Chickamauga demonstrated the Union's ability to adapt and recover from major defeats. Within days of receiving news of the battle, Lincoln had ordered General Joseph Hooker with 2 corps from the Army of the Potomac to proceed immediately to Tennessee. General William Tecumseh Sherman was dispatched from Mississippi with additional reinforcements. Most significantly, Lincoln removed Rosecrans from command and replaced him with General Ulysses Grant, who was given overall authority in the Western theater. The human cost of Chickamauga extended far beyond the military casualties. Families throughout Georgia, Tennessee, Alabama, and dozens of other states received the dreaded news that their sons, fathers, and brothers had fallen in the bloody woods along Chickamauga Creek. The battle had created thousands of widows and orphans, adding to the enormous social disruption that the war had already caused across American society. For the soldiers who survived the battle, both Union and Confederate, Chickamauga became a defining experience that they would carry for the rest of their lives. Veterans' accounts written decades later still conveyed the horror of fighting in the smoke-filled woods where men died. Unseen in units became lost within yards of each other. Many participants described the battle as the most intense combat they experienced. During 4 years of almost continuous warfare, the strategic implications of the Confederate victory began to unfold rapidly. General Grant's appointment to overall command in the West brought a new level of coordination and aggressiveness to Union operations. Within 2 months, the battles of Lookout Mountain and Missionary Ridge had reversed the verdict of Chickamauga, driving Bragg's army from Tennessee and opening the gateway to Georgia. The Confederate victory that had seemed so complete in September had been turned into the beginning of an irreversible Confederate retreat. General George Thomas's heroic stand on Snodgrass Hill became one of the enduring legends of the Civil War, earning him the sobriquet the Rock of Chickamauga that would follow him throughout his career. His defense had saved the Army of the Cumberland from complete destruction and preserved the Union's ability to continue operations in the Western Theater. Thomas's performance at Chickamauga established him as one of the Union's premier defensive generals and led to his appointment as Sherman's most trusted subordinate. The Battle of Chickamauga also marked the beginning of the end for General Bragg's troubled command of the Army of Tennessee. His failure to exploit the victory completely, combined with ongoing conflicts with his subordinate generals, led to his removal from command following the defeats at Chattanooga. The Confederate Army would never again achieve such a complete tactical victory, and the loss of momentum after Chickamauga contributed significantly to the eventual collapse of Confederate resistance in the Western Theater. As the autumn leaves fell in the forests around Chickamauga Creek, covering the graves of thousands of American soldiers, the battle's true significance became apparent. The Confederate victory had been real but ultimately hollow, purchased at a price the South could not afford to pay. The Union defeat had been devastating but not decisive, overcome by the North's superior ability to replace losses and adapt to setbacks. Chickamauga had tested America's will, and that will, though battered and bloodied, had proven unbreakable. The battle served as a stark reminder that in civil war, every victory comes with a cost too terrible to measure, and every defeat carries within it the seeds of future redemption.